Okay, so thanks everybody for being here, and thanks Professor Bai for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be at Fudan in Shanghai in general. I've been to Beijing many times, but this is actually the first time I came here, and the city itself looks incredibly interesting. Yes, to go straight to the point, the title of my talk says already something quite important. Epistocracy and meritocracy are two different things. And we might say that epistocracy and meritocracy are shorthands for two longer expressions, liberal epistocracy and Confucian meritocracy. Okay, but let me start with a couple of preliminary remarks. So, first of all, I'm not at all an expert in Confucian meritocracy. Much of what I know is something I read in the work of Professor Bai, Daniel Bell, Daniel Chan, and other scholars. My presentation is an exercise in Anglophone normative political theory. So there won't be any ambition to do something original in terms of interpretation of old authors. What I'm doing is mostly conceptual. So I try to describe models and normative. So I try to figure out what this model tells us to do and whether these proposals are sound or not. So, to start, what do we mean by liberal epistocracy and what do we mean by Confucian meritocracy? Epistocracies are societies in which decision-making bodies give formally greater weight, if not exclusive entitlement, to competent citizens. So when you read a paper and you find a definition like that, you should pay attention at least to 2 points. First, formally, the word formally. The word formally says that we want to give people with competence by law decision-making power. It's not just a case that the competent people are in position of making relevant decisions. They are there because there are laws empowering them to do so. And second, we need to think of what the expression competency means and how can we figure out procedures that enable us to select the competent ones in our societies. And then we have meritocracies. Meritocracies are societies in which a political system should aim to promote leaders with superior ability and virtue. Again, when you read a definition like this, which I basically take from a 2013 collection on meritocracy, you should pay attention to at least 3 points. The expression superior ability and virtue that suggest us that competence is not enough. There's also a moral component, which is relevant, philosophical and normative relevant. And then again, when you say that people with superior ability and virtue should be in decision-making power position, we have the same question. How do we find such people? How do we, in more procedural terms, define such people? How do we define criteria that in procedural terms enable us to find such people? And third point, we need to be clear with a distinction, the distinction between meritocracy, again, as a system, a selection principle, so to say, and meritorious rule. Meritorious rule is an ideal. It's an ideal that, in principle, can be pursued by any kind of regime. Any kind of regime can be meritorious. A meritocracy can also be meritorious depending on how it governs. So be clear with this dichotomy. And then if you want to be a little bit more general, here I'm not saying epistocratic arrangement or meritocratic arrangement, I'm saying epistocracies and meritocracies. And by this expression, I mean societies in general in which a certain selection mechanism is in place. And we will see later in this presentation the transition from the decision-making, the way you select decision-makers and society is important to understand relevant normative differences between these two concepts. Okay, from this relatively straightforward preliminary remarks, today I am to do three things. First, I present you epistocracies and meritocracy, try to define them in a philosophical way. Second, and this is a little bit more original part of the presentation, I try to compare this proposal and show similarities and differences. And finally, in the concluding part of the presentation, which will be quite speculative, I try to open up a discussion about the way people like me who do Anglophone normative political theories can and should engage with different normative proposals coming from different traditions. So the things I'm saying bit from papers I've already published in some part, but there are also some new ideas that I want to test with you today. Okay, to start. What is a liberal epistocracy? To understand the relevance in today's debate on the legitimacy of a political system and why epistocracy has become so prominent, we need to make a step backward and understand that in recent years, especially in Western liberal democracy, the positive picture described the democratic system have been the subject of increasingly vocal criticisms. The criticisms are mainly of two sorts. First, that there's an important assumption for the democratic system to work, and it's related to the right to stand. You know, for the democratic system to work, you need to have good people that are ready and willing to get into power positions. And we see that virtuous people are rarely willing to run for office in the recent years. But second, the strongest criticism to the liberal democratic systems nowadays connects with us, lay citizens, and especially with some cognitive distortions that characterize our approach to news, pieces of information, and political parties in general. To quote a famous American philosopher, Jason Brennan, who wrote a famous book against democracy, lay citizens are ignorant, irrational, and misinformed. They are also partisan and tribalistic, despite most of them being non-ideological. Lay citizens tend to be short-sighted, stubborn, and incompetent. So, drawing upon these sort of claims and empirical evidence highlighting this claim, an increasingly large number of political theorists and political epistemologists has started blaming democracy for its incapacity to protect citizens from the harm of bad policies. In general, those sort of arguments are pretty much constructed in the same way. They tend to show that an epistocratic system is better than a democratic system because it can generate better policy outcome. And given the fact that it generates better political outcome, it will be more legitimate. So political legitimacy is usually taken to be the criterion of comparison. So we can take Jason Brennan's argument as sort of standard to understand how these people think and develop their theory. So the argument is quite simple. It's really textbook political philosophy. There are 4 premises. Premise 1, a political regime is more legitimate when it tends to make decisions that approximate a common good. Premise 2, decisions that approximate the common good can be reached by drawing upon the best available evidence. So be clear the link between common good and evidence. Premise 3, mastering the best available social scientific evidence can facilitate decision-making that can approximate the common good. So the more I know, the more likely I am to make the right decision. Premise 4, the most important one, while many lay citizens are not even able to master the best available social evidence, there's a minority of citizens that can master the best available social evidence. If 1, 2, 3, and 4 are true, we can reach, according to Brennan and many other scholars, a conclusion. This conclusion can be put in 2 ways, a weaker form and a stronger form. The weaker form says a political regime is more legitimate when it gives decision-making power to citizens with the capacity to master the best available social scientific evidence. I call this a weak conclusion because pretty much all systems can randomly end up allocating decision-making power also to those people who masters the best social scientific evidence. And in fact, this is not the sort of claim that people like Brennan want to make. They make a much stronger conclusion. A political regime is more legitimate when just those competent citizens have decision-making power. It's not the 2 groups and the fact that it may happen that the most competent one are in decision-making power position, but it's a system structure so that only the competent one can make decisions that are for the interest of, that should represent the interest of the entire population. Then again, when you make this sort of argument, you go back to a fundamental procedural question. How can we select only those citizens with the capacity to make superior political judgment based on the best available evidence? This sort of question in the past 10 years has inspired very many different arguments. There are dozens of arguments, dozens of normative proposals. Here I list just a few of them. There are people say that we should administer a competence test to voters. We test voters, we see whether they have enough cognitive capacity, and on the assumption that if they have enough cognitive capacity, they can select the right representative, and those right representatives will make decisions that are in the interest of everybody and inspired by the common good. Then there's a second proposal we draw upon the philosophy of a famous English thinker, John Stuart Mill, and this idea that we should implement a plural voting system, a system in which the most qualified member of the society have more votes than the others. Then there's a third proposal, which is the idea of assigning veto power to a council of experts. So you do things as they are, but on top of that, you also set a council of experts, and those council of experts can stop some policies. Or if you want to be a little more AI sensitive or tech savvy, you can use surveys that track what is supposed to be common sense among the best educated people, the most competent one. And once you get their political preferences on certain specific issues, you try to write and implement policies that are in some way reflective of such preferences. Or you, and we, in this way, we slowly get closer to the new Confucian meritocracy scene. You can try to think of special institutional issues directives in a conditional form. They are essentially consultative bodies that tell policymakers what they should do. There's an interesting thing in all these proposals. So they said the argument as if they were entirely novel and, totally original proposal, but for each of these proposals, if you look them closely, you can back in the history of political thought and find same sort of proposal vis-a-vis the same sort of problems back in the 19th, 20th, and 18th century. So societies change often, but problems always remain the same. And answer to the problem also tend to remain the same. Okay, among the scene of tentative proposal to solve the idea that the lay citizens may lack the necessary competence to make certain kind of decisions, some scholars have also drawn upon argument in the new Confucian philosophy. So the best thing to do now is try to see what the new Confucian philosophy say and what we mean by Confucian meritocracy. Okay. And then we get to the third part of my presentation. Okay. Okay. I guess that most of you, if not all of you, know much better than I do that meritorious rules is one of the most central ideas of Confucian political theory. And in simple terms, we can put the idea as follows. Those people who occupy position of power should possess more virtue and ability. Recall what I said at the beginning, virtue and ability. And the second idea that there should be a correlation between position and virtue. Here we can go back to Mencius who says only the benevolent man is fit to be in high position. This is a much quoted passage that you will find in pretty much all papers and books dealing with the idea of Confucian meritocracy. So, in this context, governing means to govern for the people. And again, here we can go back to an old concept, the principle of Minban, which really make us see the instrumental structure, architecture of the Confucian approach to political thinking. Minban, meaning treating the people as roots. People deserve care, deserve attention, deserve someone that has the necessary ability, but also the moral interest in respecting and taking care of those who will be affected by certain decisions. If you accept this basic layout of the premises of the theory, you go back again to the usual practical and philosophical questions. How can we bring about meritorious rules? How can we be sure that we have correspondence between office and virtue and ability? And here we can look back at both history of political theory, but also to a recent definition made famous by Chan. And the idea is that Confucian thinkers have been thinking of two methods to answer this question. There are ex ante ways and ex post ways to distinguish virtuous persons from non-virtuous persons. Ex ante ways are ways that are probably the most intuitive ones, that are ways to select and place the most appropriate people in position of power. And you can think of examination, for instance, here. Ex post ways are less intuitive, are ways through which we try to enable those in power to continue cultivating their virtue when they are leading, when they are in important political positions. It's important when you, this is very important, and when you approach in general virtue theories, especially when it's applied to political thinking, we tend to, argument often function in the same way. There's this virtue, political leaders should have this virtue, we need to find a way to make those two nets together. But there's also another aspect which is less intuitive but also very important. Virtue, and this is a thing that you find also in Aristotle, needs to be cultivated. If you don't cultivate the virtue, a virtuous man, a virtuous woman can stop being virtuous. It's important that people in the, in their upbringing, in their normal everyday experience, find ways that make them able to always increase their capacity to being virtuous agents. And especially to be judged by other moral agents and recognized by other moral agents as virtuous agents. This is quite intuitive. Think of the people that you find virtuous on the street, and then you thought, oh, this is a virtuous guy, he has done that, and then you find it 10 years later, and he has done something very different. You say, oh, this is not the guy I met 10 years ago. You don't want that when people are in position of power. We want people that are consistent in their moral commitment. And you also want procedures that enable us to check that people are consistent. Okay, so this idea that there are people with superior practical and moral abilities, this idea that a system has to reflect the differences between people with superior with superior virtue and ability and lay citizens like me, for instance. This sort of implicit hierarchy that the system entails has motivated over the 20th century widespread skepticism, especially in the West, toward the idea of a Confucian meritocracy. And especially scholars and political leaders, we can think here of Samuel Huntington, for instance, have debated long time around the idea of a fundamental incompatibility between Confucian moral and political values and the democratic ideal. However, in the last 2 decades, a new wave of scholars has been proposing way to combine meritocratic governance and some aspects of democratic ways of making decisions and selecting representatives. 3 main figures have animated the debate. Guess who? Dong Dong Bai, Joseph Chan, and Daniel Bell. So there's at least other than like the 3 of them drawing upon Confucian political thinking, there's also another shared ground in the 3 proposals. Essentially, the 3 proposals had a meritocratic parliamentary chambers. So you have a system that they recognize that in the system there's a need for an additional side of decision making in which people with certain attributes should be entitled and enabled to make collectively binding decisions. So, Bell and Bai propose probably the two most refined model. Joseph Chan's model is not as refined. So let me go through the three proposals. So Daniel Bell, we could call it an examination model. He proposed the use of a competitive examination, which is supposed to evaluate a number of different things, including memorization, independent thinking, and knowledge of history, for instance, to select people with special virtue and talent to be member of a second chamber, which he calls the House of Virtue and Talent. This second chamber, unlike many other second chambers you will find across the globe, has an important procedural entitlement. It can override majorities in the lower house. So Daniel Bell's proposal has met several criticisms. I don't want to go into that today. There's one that I think it's particularly interesting, and it can draw upon our experience as people that have done examinations. It's very difficult to actually accept the idea that examination can test the moral quality of an individual. Because when we approach an exam in order to pass it. So, to quote the word of another important scholar, examination push us to engage in a crafty hypocrisy. They push us to give the right answer. They don't push us to give the most sincere answer. But if you want to also test the moral quality of the leader, how can you deal with this discrepancy? The second proposal we have, it's tongued on by a proposal of a leveled system, which he sometimes called Kung Fu China. Here, the idea that common people are allowed to participate in local decision-making side, which deals with local affairs they are familiar with. He also introduced an examination system which essentially is taught to enable selection of component meritocrat that again should go into a meritocratic house. Such people have intellectual and moral merits. Such people could also, in principle, be selected to quotas, he also says. But again, the idea is that you select through an examination, through quotas, or through the combination of the two, some especially well-equipped people that will go to an upper house where they will have to take decision on complex matter. There's an assumption here in the idea that there's an assumption here which is very important also in disputes in more internal disputes on Confucian meritocracy. The idea of making people participate at least in local affairs go back to often unexplored idea at the heart of Confucian political philosophy, is the idea that there's some sort of practical and psychological benefit of making people involved in ways of, in forms of collective decision making. Okay, so Bell and Bai. But there's also a third proposal, as I said. And this third proposal is not as much as their proposal is not as concerned to, selecting the people in the first place, but is more concerned to be sure that, those people that are in that specific chambers are the right one, that they have been persistent in showcasing their special virtue and ability. And Joseph Chandler proposed again the idea of adding another meritocratic chamber, but this time meritocratic chamber is not selected, members of a meritocratic chamber are not selected through an exam. We fill such chamber by finding public servants who have been positively recommended by other public servants. So the idea is that if you want to recognize those people who really have the right attitude and ability, it's not enough to test them. You also have to rely on people that have special relationship with them, that recognize in them a special attitude. Okay, 3 proposals, Bell, By, and Chance. A common idea, the idea of adding on top of a lower house what we might call a meritocratic house. These proposals have, by many people in the debate on epistocracy, have been taken in a very simplistic way, copy-pasted and used as alternatives to other forms of epistocratic arrangements. Here the question is that we should ask ourselves: is this copy-paste, simplified copy-paste of models a legit intellectual and philosophical operation? Before giving an answer to such a difficult question, I think we need to run a comparison between the two models, an epistocratic, the liberal epistocracy, and the Confucian meritocracy. So let's start with the similarities. So the most obvious one, which I guess reads like a platitude. Both proposals explicitly value competence. Competence, however, is of course defined in different ways, and we will see in a minute. And both models create normative proposals to allocate more decision-making power to an elite of competent people. So the link between formally allocating decision-making power and competence and differently defined competence is a common trait between epistocracy and meritocracy. This second similarity is a little bit more conceptually sophisticated and look at the conception of legitimacy. Both proposals are grounded or tend to be grounded on what we might call an instrumentalist conception of legitimacy. On this view, a political system is legitimate because it has decision-making power that are reliable means to reach morally best outcomes, such as laws, policies, or even human flourishing. I refer to the concept of Minben in Confucian political philosophy. A common aspects of many proposal of epistocratic arrangement is their utilitarian commitment. Utilitarian commitment is, by definition, a consequentialist proposal. And when applied to theories of legitimacy, it usually tend to value institutions that deliver good outcomes. There's a third similarities that, and in this way we progress again, we go a little bit more conceptually sophisticated, I think, and there's a third similarities between epistocracy and meritocracy, and this similarity connects with the link between stability and legitimate ruling based on outcomes. Following the same instrumental logic, liberal epistocracy and Confucian meritocracy assume that their proposal, the society in which such proposals are implemented, to be put a little bit more in a more elegant way, will be stable. And they will be stable for two reasons. Selection procedures, as the one I listed a few minutes ago, strengthen the capacity to produce morally desirable outcomes. So you have right way to select politicians or leaders or decision makers. You know that they are the right one, they will produce good outcomes. This is the chain of reasoning. But it's not the fact that you just produce the right outcome once at a specific moment of time. And this is insufficient as a philosophical argument to justify stability. Liberal epistocracy and Confucian meritocracy will be stable because of the repetition of morally desirable outcomes. The fact that they are consistently delivering morally desirable outcomes will minimize citizens' interest in defecting. So the two systems, and I think that this can be seen as a conceptual problem, assume that when institutions realize all the goods of a political association, the good that you can define or, in the way you prefer, citizens will be willing to defer to the guiding norms of the community. This idea can be challenged on several grounds, the conceptual link, instrumental conceptual link, but also on empirical ground, I guess. But there's one thing that is very important, and then connect the two proposals. In the two proposals, stability can be defined essentially can be read from three different perspectives. First is an enabling conditions. We need a stable social environment for institutions to function properly. If society is a mess, even a political institution filled with the best people will struggle to deliver good policies. Then, stability is not only a precondition, and here you see why the concept of stability is so important, it's also a good externality of good government. Is a stable social environment. The social environment enable institutions to make the right policies. The fact that the right policies are in place create interest in staying with the system. And then there's a third aspect, which is extremely important, and is the idea that stability is in itself is not an end. In both In both liberal epistocracy and Confucian meritocracy, stability is not an end of institutions. Stability is a result of the fact that institutions work well. And then we can get to the fourth similarity between epistocracies and meritocracy. So recall the first three. Competence, link between competence and formal selection of the best people in society. An instrumental conception of legitimacy, the link between stability and legitimacy, and the fourth one is the idea that the conception of the relevance of moral disagreement in society. Both proposals presuppose that there can be an agreement on what is the right decision at the right time. And the fact that there's agreement at this level also justify the assumption that there can be an agreement on how the society in general can be organized. To make it very simple, the conceptual transition is that me and my wife agree on what we have to eat today at lunch, given the fact that we agree on this specific issue, there's also a justification for my claim that we agree on how we should construct our relationship between the two of us over time. And then again, this idea that you can translate agreement on certain issue into agreement on how a society should be organized has been object of intense criticism over the past years. So, 4 similarities. But there are obviously also differences, otherwise it doesn't really make much sense, most of what I said so far. Okay, difference. The interesting thing is the first difference is exactly the same as the first similarity. So, the conception of political competence. In Confucian meritocracy, people, it's like a read like a motto, but it's, I think it really get the sense. People, one may say, not policy make good government. This gives strong conceptual priority to virtue over technical expertise. On the other hand, the conception of political competence in liberal epistocracy is strictly technical. Political competence is essentially a combination of 2 things. A politically competent people can do 2 things. He can master the best social scientific evidence, especially concerning economic policies, and given the fact that he is a well-educated person, he also is intellectually humble. So he's ready to revise his or her own judgment. The idea is, the postulation is that there's quite a correlation between these 2 traits. Those who know more about social scientific evidence are also those that are more ready to change their ideas. Lay citizens know nothing, according to those accounts, and are even stubborn. Behind this idea that Jason Brennan has, that there exists a superior political judgment, and then the capacity to make superior political judgment is not equally distributed across the population. Again, pay attention to words when you do analytic normative political theory. The idea is not equally distributed in the population means that it's not equally distributed now. It might be equally distributed in the future if, according to his argument, society persistently makes the right decision. The right decision will have an uplifting power to otherwise ignorant and stubborn lay citizens. Okay, but this is very conceptual criticism, mostly for academic journals. There's also another difference between meritocracy and epistocracy, which I think is much more interesting for today's seminar. And I call this difference the problem of virtues institutional culture, or as I call it in the paper, the problem of the meritocratic worldview. Okay. Confucian meritocracy contains, as you know, a substantive view of people's good life. And in light of this substantive conception, it holds that rulers should strive to become outstanding exemplars of the good life for other people to follow. So, I am an exemplar for someone when I share something, when I share when some values are shared between those that will be affected by my decision and myself. Focus your attention on this idea of shared values, shared common ground. And here we can read a passage from Professor Zbai's paper in which he says, if the Confucian idea can be realized, it depends on the mainstream culture of each state. If most people take the one person, one vote principle as something sacred, it might be difficult to justify the transition from one mechanism of selection to another. So you need the meritocratic meritocratic experiment, let's call it this way, is somehow dependent on the existence of a shared meritocratic worldview across the population. And this is partly confirmed by empirical work done by Don Chulshin in a paper published in 2013, in which he attests that in Confucian Asia, there are more qualified supporters than unqualified supporters of purely democratic arrangements. Okay, so we need a shared worldviews, which combines respect for competence, but also some sort of moral values for the meritocratic experiment to function. The question we should ask, the first simple question we should ask, do societies in which liberal epistocratic arrangements are noticing a problem, do they have such meritocratic worldview? Do people in such social environments share this meritocratic worldview? Yes or no? I led this for the question and answer session. But here, what is more interesting again is try to be a little more philosophically sophisticated and try to understand why this sort of cultural link between rulers and ruled is important. And here I want to recall a line of reasoning made famous by one of the most important philosophers and social theorists of the 20th century, Max Weber. So when we think of the legitimacy of a certain institutional arrangement, we should also link, even when we think it in a philosophical way, especially when we're thinking in a philosophical way in instrumental terms, we should link our discourse with an observation of the shared system of ideas and values that are in place in that specific society. The shared system of ideas and values play two functions. On the one hand, it contributes to the justification of the claimed right to rule that the institution wants to have. Second, it creates incentive in the population to obey to specific decision. To make it simple, since I share some values and ideas with those who are ruling me, I share the basic language, moral language, and language of justification through which they will justify decisions that affect me. So it will be easier for them to make such decision palatable to me, but I also will be more in tune with what they say. I will be ready to obey. And here the question is, that we should ask ourselves is, if it's really true what Professor Bai and other scholars say, that we need to be careful in looking at the presence of a shared culture for the meritocratic experiment to function, we should also think what are the 4 conditions that these systems require. What are the 4 conditions that the meritocratic experiments require, at least as a sort of simplified meritocratic worldviews? And I think we can identify exactly 4 issues. First, citizens and rulers should share the same view on moral excellence. And moral excellence is a combination of ability and virtue. Recall what I said 40 minutes ago, I guess. Then, second, citizens and rulers should share the idea that education can strengthen moral excellence. If you want, as the word itself says, meritocracy is also the result of particular achievements. If you want to select the meritocratic elite to an exam, you need to have a shared respect of the value of education that make people ready to pass such an exam. In such a society, therefore, education should be seen as an important public good. And then, last condition, citizens and rulers should believe in an idea of upward mobility that motivate reverence for those who display more competence. So here it's important to stop a second. So in a society in which there's a shared view on moral excellence, where education is considered as among the relevant factors that contribute to individual moral excellence, in which education is generally considered as a public good, we need to also to have this additional mechanism, the idea that education is a trigger for upward mobility, because this sort of trigger make us accept the fact that other people, that when we fail at the exam and other people that are probably more competent than us will pass the exam, and we won't be suspicious of the procedure itself. We see that since we know that education is value, since we know that it takes long time for us to get ready to pass the exam, we think we tend to respect those other citizens who have been able to pass the exam or qualified better than us. Even so, the presence of a meritocratic worldview is very important for the meritocratic system to be implemented in a certain society. Even an unorthodox interpreter like Song Moon Kim recognized that in East Asian societies that are obviously internally different from one another, there's a distinctively Confucian public culture. For which core Confucian values are filiality, social harmony, respect for the elderly, and respectful deference. According to him, such values are widely cherished and considered as public virtues independently of the specific religion or value system a person supports. Given the fact that there is shared views, shared meritocratic worldview, shared Confucian public culture, the meritocratic experiment can get traction. So, do we have the same sort of social and cultural background in the Western context? Not so sure. But, so I'm moving to the conclusion of my talk, and I just want to recap what I've been doing so far. So I have presented what is a liberal epistocracy. I also presented what is a Confucian meritocracy. I try to show there are fundamental conceptual similarities, but there are also fundamental conceptual differences. And those conceptual differences should make us think that it's not always that easy to take a model, even in a very simplified form, and use it as a proposal which can be valid in another context, where other values, other ideas, other worldviews are dominant. This comparison, I think, can help me to introduce the last and more speculative part of my presentation, which deals with a much broader methodological topic that goes way beyond the disputes, the normative disputes about epistocracies and meritocracies. And the problem is simply put, how can we use alien traditions and non-Western normative proposals in Anglophone normative political theory? This will be the topic of the last part of my presentation for the next 5-10 minutes. Okay. So, Bell, Chan, and Bai all of them offer important insights for people like me, for instance, to critically examine dominant normative paradigm. But their proposal also show another thing. They show that it's not so easy to simply copy-paste some aspects of a normative model and combine it with another that runs on completely different assumptions. So there are two, in this intellectual operation of translating or importing, probably importing is a better word, the Confucian meritocracy into the Western world, there are two opposing tendencies. There's a positive tendency, the positive tendency of enabling a critical attitude toward the dominant paradigm. There's also sort of negative tendency it makes us vulnerable to simplistic way of making political theory. I think that at the core of these two opposing tendencies, there's a more general philosophical question. What does it mean today to do normative political theory with a global scope? After all, if a theory addressing problems that are global in scope, such as what is a just form of government, what is a legitimate form of government, aims philosophy that deals with such global problems, with problems that have been facing societies throughout history and geographically as well, if such philosophy aims to be convincing outside its own tradition, being that in the East or in the West, it should be robust enough to deal with a simple observation. A simple observation that everybody makes as a traveler, that there are multiple systems of norm, rules, and institutional normative orders that are dominant, prevalent, and accepted across the globe. How can we construct assumptions and arguments based on the simple observation that people find and accept as compelling different normative proposals? How can we be sure that our proposal is really global or universal as it aims to be? Unfortunately, most contemporary normative political theory tend to work within a single tradition. Either tend to draw upon history to work in a narrow sense within a certain tradition, or just take the dominant assumption as the valid ones. At least in noticing this problem, an increasingly large number of scholars with many different motivations and methodologies has been trying to enable dialogue between different traditions and form of theorizing. Here I think of scholars such as Lee Jenko, Diego von Vacano, Nick Tampio, Fred Almer. There are many scholars doing this sort of conceptual operation. But doing this conceptual operation is not intrinsically valuable. It depends on how you do that, on why you do that, and what you want to achieve with this conceptual operation. There's a risk in, for instance, comparing normative proposal regarding how to rule a people, a population, a country. The urgency of making a global in scope political theory can lead to a reflective style of reasoning that make us accept everything else as interesting, or that make us conclude that everything is acceptable. And we don't want to do that as political theorists. We want to find a proposal that approximates truth, a stance objection coming from people from different cultural background or different moment in history. And I think that we can identify three different attitudes in the debate on the dialogue between different traditions in normative political theory. The first attitude is the attitude of what I call the desk bounds. The second attitude is the attitude of what I call the globetrotter. And the third attitude is the attitude of what I call the pathfinder. So, what is the attitude of a desk bound? A desk bound is a person that spends most of his time sitting in front of his desk. It doesn't really move. It just stays there. When we have a desk-bound attitude to the dialogue with different philosophical tradition, and so we share the preoccupation of reaching a global and universalistic style of reasoning, the risk is that we fail to problematize enough those other traditions, and we end up with some sort of orthodox relativism. An orthodox relativism for which all claims are valid in their own context. When I think of desk bounds, and I say that this led of this orthodox relativism, I have in mind especially some postmodernist and post-structuralist thinkers that have tried to advance normative proposals about what is a legitimate democratic government, for instance. But desk bounds are quite old style. You don't find many of them nowadays. We can travel more easily. We can do intellectual exchanges. We can come here and give a talk. So we rarely, it's unusual to find very idealized, at least in the academic and scholarly publication, it's very unusual to find idealized pictures of what an alien context is. There's a much more widespread tendency, which is the attitude of the globetrotters. The globetrotter is someone that travels around and pick here and there. The globetrotter, the idea of globetrotter, when applied to the dialogue between traditions, essentially aim to show us that the idea that those people think that historically marginalized traditions have something to say about problems at the center of contemporary normative disputes. But the problem is not that they have something to say. The problem is how globetrotters deals with such theories. They take old and canonical texts essentially as a repository of fresh ideas. Fresh ideas that can be applied to our own problems, can be applied reflectively to our own problems. And this is how, for instance, epistocrats have used Confucian meritocratic thinking in Western normative political theory. This approach, I think, tends to overlook a simple fact that has been masterfully described by an African philosopher named Kavazi Viredu, who says, cultural traditions are always a complex heritage, contradictory and heterogeneous, an open set of options. In our case, for instance, that of epistocracy and meritocracy, a too simplistic reference to Confucian meritocracy as an instance, a valuable or similar instance of epistocratic arrangement neglects fundamental conceptual and contextual difference within the theory. It also overlooks important conceptual disputes within scholarship of contemporary Confucian political philosophy. And here I think, among others, of the work of Sang Kwon Kin and his civility argument based on a reading of the horizontal character of Confucian rituals. So when you have a too simplistic globetrotter attitude to what other tradition says, we tend to create a simplistic construction. We can tend to create a model that is applicable to our own premises. And in doing so, we neglect that there might be conflictual interpretation of the same problem within that same tradition. Or that some key passages are in, that scholars read some key passages in different ways. But hopefully, I think there's a third type of attitude to approach the dialogue between different traditions. And with this attitude, I conclude. So this is the attitude of what I call pathfinders. Pathfinders treat the encounter with distant others as an opportunity to question one's mode of understanding. So, as opposed to globetrotters, pathfinders engage other worlds, not just as a source of inputs, ideas, and examples, but as a way to raise new questions to their own society or to themselves. It is with this third attitude of reciprocal self-questioning that I think the dialogue between Democrats, liberal epistocrats, and Confucian meritocrats should be approached and understood not really as a debate oriented toward finding specific answers to big problems, but rather as an opportunity to generate new questions. Question that even exceeds the much explored issues about the translation of proposal from one context to another. Question, I think, that use comparison and encounters as instrument to approximate truth, even truth concerning old philosophical questions, which, and here I give some example, question, for instance, of the character of a political leader, questions on the limiting or enabling force of value systems, questioning on the embeddedness of evaluative categories, question on the intrinsic value of certain decision-making processes, and so on and so forth. These are difficult questions, and I don't have an answer today. But at least I hope that my reflection on liberal epistocracy and Confucian meritocracy have helped shows that there's some value in unpacking too simplistic categories and avoid easy generalization. Epistocracies and meritocracies, if put together, compared and confronted, force us to think to at least two key problems that have been going with us throughout history, throughout history of human society. First, the value of outcomes in claims about political legitimacy. How much should we consider the quality of the outcome in evaluating our political system? And second, the relationship between stability and legitimacy. Does stability come first? Does legitimacy come first? How the two concepts are interconnected. These are key philosophical questions. These are important questions, I think, of interest for political theories in the East and in the West. Thanks.